tell us your name and how did you first get into chatbots?
I'm Tim Kay. Chatbots, I have to go back to the mid-90s. The first startup I did with Robert Hoffer, we were doing directory services, so online newspapers. Newspapers were still a big deal, and they were all trying to go online. And our contribution was that we built the white pages and yellow pages. I had built the white pages for Yahoo, and then we started our own startup called Query Labs, and we were working with Advanced Publications, which was a large newspaper publication in the country. That put us in competition head-to-head with Elon Musk and his first startup, which was not PayPal, but it was called Zip2. And they were working with McClatchy, which were a bunch of other online newspapers. Elon managed to leverage that into a decent payoff, which took him into PayPal and so on. Ours crashed and burned. And I had sworn that I didn't want to work with Robert Hoffer again, and I hadn't talked to him for an entire year. And then in January of 2000, for the first conversation we had in a long time, and we used to be really close and spent a lot of time together, but the first conversation in a year, and we came up with the idea of chatbots on instant messaging. I was showing him instant messaging, which was new at the time. I said, hey, check this out, and sent him to AOL, and we were chatting a little bit. And then suddenly it occurred to us that it'd be great to hook up a computer. And he was pretending to be the user and sent me what's the price of IBM? And then I went and copied and pasted the response, and it's like, yeah, this is great. So right then, that was like January 7th, 2000. And we agreed that I would write a prototype, and he said he'd go and do some fundraising. And it took me about 2 weeks to put together a chatbot on instant messaging. And first people he talked to, they gave us $4 million. We had $4 million in the bank in February in 2000, which was crazy at the time. So then we had to get a team together, and this was really difficult because this was the dot-com boom. You could not hire anybody, and you couldn't get office space either. So we're just struggling to find people to hire. And fortunately, the internet had come along, and nobody was buying software anymore. There were companies that were in the software business selling software. And specifically, there was a company called Raydream that was making ray tracing 3D rendering software at the time and doing marginally well and prepared to grow. And then suddenly the internet comes along and nobody is buying software. And they finally just decided we're closing shop, selling off all the assets, and they laid everybody off. And I knew the team there, and I managed to convince the VP of engineering to come on board. And he brought several of his team with him. So this was a great way to jumpstart a great development team. Now, we also needed some expertise in instant messaging because there's protocols and all that, and I didn't know anything about that. And you can't just go to AOL and hire somebody away. So I thought, what's the next best thing? Which is, so you had Linux at the time, and there were some instant messaging clients on Linux. And somebody was in charge of writing those, and I went and figured out who. I came up with 3 candidates. And long story short, there was a 17-year-old kid in Arizona, Adam Fritzler. And I get him on the phone, and he was very skeptical. Apparently, he'd worked for some other startup there, and they'd burned him. And so I said, hey, we're doing this startup. We have $4 million in the bank, and we want you to be part of the team. He said, well, he's starting at University of Colorado Boulder the following fall. And I said, all right, well, come out and work with us for the summer. So he says, I don't know. So we said, look, we'll buy you a plane ticket. You come out, have lunch with us, see what you think. And so that was arranged. And it's at that point that I realized that I had just met this guy on the internet. He was a minor, and I was flying him across state lines to come meet with us. So I brought a chaperone, and the meeting went well, and he came and spent the summer with us, decided to defer school, ended up applying and getting into Berkeley and Santa Cruz and is now in charge of optics at Planet. So that's Adam. We had a team in New York that was in charge of the content. And our original thought was, let's do stock quotes and weather and sports and so on. And we got a great team together. Now, one of the amazing things about our team is that you couldn't hire anybody technical. And this turned out to be a huge benefit, because if you can't hire anybody technical, who do you want to build your app? Do you want somebody technical, the lab white coat, the tape on his glasses? Or do you want subject matter experts? So we ended up hiring anybody available. We got a book publisher, a school teacher, a rock musician. And this was great for several reasons. First, it meant that the content was more interesting. But secondly, it forced us to develop a platform for creating bots that was approachable. So we built a platform to do the bots that could be coded by people who were non-technical. So think of like Excel. You can train anybody to code in Excel, and some people don't even think of it as coding, but our bot platform was that simple. So then the question is, what do you do with it? We're just several months in, and we have the ability to create bots, and we have some really sharp people who are interesting and doing some coding. And we built at that time what we called the old boring guys app, which was stock quotes and dictionary definitions and all that. And they poured their hearts into getting this thing nice. And by coincidence, AOL had just made changes to AOL Instant Messenger to support bots. Not for that reason, but it was just a great coincidence. So we could launch with them immediately. The partnership came together quickly, and we launched SmarterChild in late 2000, maybe it was early 2001. And there was $0 spent on advertising. So it was all organic growth. People would tell their friends, hey, go talk to SmarterChild. So people would add SmarterChild to their buddy list, and they'd say hi. And SmarterChild would say, hi, I'm SmarterChild, built by ActiveBuddy. And then it says, say home to see what I can do. So people would, everybody on the planet did the same experience. They would say hi, they would say home. It would list out a few things it could do, and so some people would try weather, a query with weather. Some would do a sports score. Some would do a dictionary definition. And then the next query for everybody on the planet was the same. They would all say, fuck you. And the boring bot would say, I don't know what you mean by that. And this was frustrating our team. Everybody was saying, what is wrong with people? And so they kept working on the apps and stuff like that. And traffic grew slowly and like that. But one day, in a fit of frustration, one of our guys, he'd done some coding, but he was a rock musician, Chris Bray. He went home one weekend, and in a fit of frustration, he wrote the profanity handler. So when you cursed at it, it would say, are all humans so rude? Or and other great things like that. By the way, our deal with AOL was such that we weren't allowed to say crude things, obviously. So and we had ELIZA-like functionality in there. So if you said something, it might turn around and say it back as one of the possibilities. But if they said something nasty, we didn't want to say that back. So Chris, as part of what he did that weekend, was he captured every possible profanity in the human language, I guess, in there. Things I have no idea what they even mean, just to make sure that they were embargoed. And he comes back, and we launched this thing on Monday morning. And suddenly our traffic took off like a rocket. And we realized at that point, we stumbled into it, that people weren't interested in stock quotes, right? They were interested in chat, and what we called inane chat. And people would chat with this thing for hours. It was quite remarkable. And in fact, our deal with AOL was that we would have to report statistics. So many people played a game of hangman, and so many people did dictionary definitions, broken down as a pie chart, number of percent. But one thing we never told them in the entire history of our relationship was that before we reported that pie chart, we filtered out the inane chat, just discarded it. And that was something like 97% of the queries. So when we're reporting on, games of hangman, that really doesn't tell the story. It was inane chat. An example, so what do you do with it? Now we got this great technology. We're ramping up over the next year to like 8 million users, which was a lot for the time. The internet was pretty small back then. And so what do you do with it? We tried doing brand marketing. You know, everybody's doing banner ads and that kind of thing. And it was very effective as a brand marketing tool. For example, Elle Girl magazine says that SmarterChild, well, not SmarterChild, but the bot we built for Elle Girl magazine, using the same technology, called Elle Girl Buddy, was largely responsible, or a significant contributor in terms of the success of the magazine's launch. And they did a white paper. It was amazing that, so instead of having a banner ad, which just links to some content in Elle Girl magazine, let's say, instead, the banner ad linked to Elle Girl Buddy on instant messaging. And people would start chatting with Elle Girl Buddy, do makeup tips or whatever. And the average engagement for that campaign was 4 minutes, which is mind-blowing. So people would engage with the buddy for 4 minutes, and then I guess they'd go subscribe to Elle Girl magazine. We did all kinds of other interesting product launches, like Radiohead albums, the one with the googly minotaur on the cover, and the Harry Potter movies. We had did a lot of movies with Warner movies. The problem is we didn't make any money with any of it. We had one big customer that was paying serious money, and that was Comcast. We had taken our bots away from instant messaging, put them in the browser, which you see all the time today. And people would, and it was on the customer support page. So if somebody showed up and said, I need an email address for my kid, it would take them through a dialogue and show them how to do that. But the problem was Comcast would not act as a marquee customer, wouldn't let us publish numbers or anything. So the company went for a number of years trying to figure out how to make money, was not terribly successful at that. And then eventually, I got through to Microsoft. For years, Microsoft, MSN Messenger was not able, that trick I said that AOL had just fixed way back conveniently, Microsoft couldn't get around to doing that. So the problem is that if you put somebody in your buddy list, so you have a buddy list, and that's great, but inside the instant messaging platform, there's also a reverse buddy list. Because if, say, I were to log in, then there'd have to be a list of everybody who has me in their buddy list, that's the reverse buddy list, so that it could send out a notification to turn my name from gray to dark so that you know I'm logged in. Well, we went ahead and launched on MSN Messenger without any cooperation with Microsoft. And it started to grow nicely. But when we hit something like 35,000 users, which was in a week or two, MSN Messenger crashed. So the problem is that you ended up with a reverse buddy list that is 35,000 users. And whenever we logged the bot in, MSN Messenger would have to go through a list of 35,000 notifications to let people know that the bot's logged in. Well, that was the same thread in the code, apparently, that was used to initiate chats. So while SmarterChild was logging in, which took maybe a minute or two, nobody could initiate a new chat. And so they blocked us. And then I personally visited Microsoft several times, worked with them over several years to try to get that fix prioritized. And they just kept coming up with other features for MSN Messenger, so bots weren't important to them, which is interesting. And finally, I left the company in like 2004. And after that, finally, they got in touch with us and said, hey, we finally made that fix, let's try it. And there's a long story involved there, but eventually they launched with us. And it worked great, and they liked it so much that they took they wanted us to take their Encarta. Think before Wikipedia, they had an online encyclopedia, or a digital encyclopedia. And they wanted us to turn that into a bot, so we did. And they liked that enough. The team I hired from Regime were French. And so they had us translate it into French. And then we started hiring language experts and translated it into 6 different languages, including Japanese. And ultimately, Microsoft bought the company. It wasn't a home run. It was the investors got their money back in a little bit. But that's the history of SmarterChild and the chatbots. So.
Thank you. Great. So how would you, so let me rephrase this. For a visitor to our museum,
Mm-hmm.
how would you explain what SmarterChild was to a current visitor who may not have known what it was?
Right. SmarterChild as a chatbot is at least 2 things when you think about it from the context of computers. One is it was quite interesting as an entertainment that got the significant amount of chat going on. But to me, what's more important is it's an example of using language as a computer interface. And you have to think about that specially. So for a long history, the Defense Department was granting money to try to figure out how to, for example, do what ChatGPT is doing today, digest full text natural language and make sense of it. But that's not what we did. We treated English, in that case, a subset of English, as a method for interacting with the computer. And there's a lot to be said about that. For example, it wouldn't understand just anything you said. For the inane chat, if we didn't understand, you could just riff and it would be fine. But when we were trying to interact in a serious way, and it could do all kinds of things, including we did personal calendars and other assistants and things, and you had to be fairly precise. But you could use a subset of the language. And I think this is something still relevant today that hasn't been explored. So part of it is setting the expectation of the user. That's why we named it SmarterChild, is that people aren't going to, if we named it Einstein, then people would ask different kinds of questions. So set the expectation, and then part of the way we crafted the interaction was to train the user in how to interact with the bot. So for example, if you would ask an ambiguous question, tell me about Java, it would go through an automatic process called disambiguation. And when that matches on coffee, on the programming language, say on the island, it would say, what do you mean? And then it wouldn't just say coffee, it would give you full sentences that would let you know what the possible categories are. But it would also inform you that if you asked that question the way that it was phrased there, it was clear to people that that would be unambiguous. And so that trained the user in how they could interact in a way that that would give them what they want more quickly. Now, another interesting thing about it is English or natural language is just a great way to interact with computers because it does naturally disambiguate. Imagine that you were doing a bot today with a bunch of different teams contributing to different knowledge domains. If you're doing that with a programming language like Java, there has to be a lot of coordination so that people don't use the same names. But with English, it doesn't matter. And it happens all the time when people naturally talk. So a team over here can create a knowledge domain that speaks about one thing, a team over here about another, and they don't have to coordinate. And the language naturally disambiguates, or that disambiguation mechanism can take it from there. So it becomes much more productive. And so English is, we still haven't started using natural language in computers very effectively. And the whole ChatGPT thing is interesting because that takes it in an entirely different dimension. On that note, I'll say that we did this, it's 23 years ago now, that we did a decent chatbot, which was the first one that got widespread attention on the internet. And I'll say that the technology, the quality of that technology has not improved prior to ChatGPT. If you look at Google voice search or Siri, the quality of those their technology is completely different. They are using the learning and all that, whereas we did production rules. But the results were no better. And it was very frustrating to me that 20 years later, I'm still struggling with Alexa at home, and it's still completely dumb. So that's what I'm really impressed with ChatGPT now, is finally, after 2 decades, there's a product that's a lot better than what we did ad hoc way back when.
How did SmarterChild work?
As I said, so how did SmarterChild work? It worked differently than the current generation of bots, which is where you create training data and do a bunch of deep learning and hope that it gives you an answer that you like. And even when it does, you can't explain why it got the answer that it did. We had a different approach, which was entirely curated. So this involved a team. We had a team of maybe 24 people writing the responses, the questions and the responses for SmarterChild and all of the other brand marketing assets that we created. We would just create what are now called production rules. So for example, you'd start with what we called back then a pattern. You could say, my name is, then all caps name. So it's all lowercase, my name is, and then all caps name, which represents a variable. And we think of the programming language Prolog from way back as where it takes 2 patterns and it does what's called unification. So it would look through all of the different patterns and see that my name is, or you might have another pattern, call me name, or name I am, something like that. And it would go and it would find the best match of all the patterns. It would do that unification so the variable name gets set to Tim, and that gets stored away so that all of the other knowledge domains can use that. And then it would run a script associated with that pattern. And that was essentially it. So now it took people to create all of the questions and write all the scripts to handle the answers. And so we created a platform where for every hour that somebody put in more work like that, that SmarterChild got an hour better, which is different than what they had tried to do historically, which is come up with just the right magical 100 lines of code or 1,000 lines of code so that then suddenly it becomes smart and runs on its own. We just knew that we weren't going to get there. Now, maybe we're closer to that these days with the ChatGPTs.
At its peak, how many users did SmarterChild have?
I don't remember that number, but I think we were doing around 1 billion queries a month.
And so I read that one of the bots on SmarterChild allowed you to play Colossal Cave Adventure. Could you talk a little bit about that?
That's a frustrating story. Well, it's actually called Adventure. Right? And that goes back. I met with Adventure when I started at Brown University in the late 70s on an IBM terminal, and it was fun, right? And that code was open source. It wasn't called open source then. It was public domain. And so while we're preparing the platform to handle the new bots that we're writing, I said to Adam Fritzler, I said, why don't you, in the meantime, just go and take the open source code that that's out there and turn that into a chatbot. And it'd be very cool because you could be doing Colossal Cave today and then forget about it and come back a month later and it would know exactly where you were and you could keep exploring the cave. And he did a prototype and it worked great. We stress tested it. We were ready to launch. And then the business guy said, no, you know what? Let's not do that obvious low-hanging fruit. Let's go make a deal with Activision, who owned some version of that code, and AOL, because it was on their instant messaging. And I don't quite understand the logic there. But now suddenly you're making a deal between 3 different companies, and that took months. So we could have just launched and been done with it and probably had a huge runaway success. And instead, they decided there was going to be all this deal. We were going to charge money for it. And months later, it never even launched, I don't believe, except for the prototype that we had out very early, which was fun. On that same note, AOL, after a year of hosting SmarterChild, said, hey, what are we doing with this? Let's make money. And by the way, I reached out to Google to see if we could run some kind of ads. And they were like all gung-ho because this is a new forum for them. Google was very new at the time. And we were working on how they would have to change the terms of use with all of their advertisers, because now we're talking about little tiny text snippets instead of banner ads. And we're making good progress on that. And then Google got distracted with this thing called an IPO. And we never actually ended up doing the deal with Google or finishing it. So no revenue from that. So AOL said, let's start charging money for it. And they thought, let's charge $10 a year. So our team took down SmarterChild, put all the mechanism together to charge $10 a year, launched it, and I think we sold about 3,000 subscriptions, which was not enough to make it at all worthwhile. In the end, we refunded all the money, made it free again, and off it went. So as I said, the company never figured out how to make money. I'd say that we were 10 years too early, because in the end, everybody needed the ability to do chat, natural language type things, right? So here we were 20 years earlier doing that, and then, or 10 years earlier, then iPhone comes out, Google Voice Search, and they were doing a terrible job of it. And Microsoft had Windows Phone at the time, and they wanted the equivalent of Siri, and they already owned our product, but they had bought it, failed with it, killed it, and forgot that they owned it. So they went and did a separate crash course in Microsoft Research, which resulted in Cortana.
Yeah, so I am interested to know more about how SmarterChild directly sort of maybe motivated the voice assistants like Siri, Alexa, Cortana.
Well, there's I know that SmarterChild was in the background when people were moving towards doing the chatbots like Siri. Fortune magazine did an article at one point interviewing Sean Carolan, who was a VC at Menlo Ventures, and he mentioned SmarterChild as part of his decision to invest in Siri. Other than that, it was just out there. Everybody had used it. A significant number of people on the internet had used SmarterChild at that point, because we were then on AOL Instant Messenger, MSN Messenger, and Yahoo Messenger.
And how did the users' use of SmarterChild differ from how you had initially envisioned it?
I spoke to how we originally saw this thing as an information utility and ended up with SmarterChild being a chatbot doing the inane chat. And there's nothing wrong with that. It was really fun. I remember, for example, visiting Microsoft and trying to convince them to prioritize the ability to support chatbots on MSN Messenger. And I had personally done the logs processing for all those billion queries, right, every month. And we would anonymize them, and then I had a nice viewer, so you could basically randomly click around and see different user sessions to get a sense of what people were doing with the product. And this was important because there was a feedback loop where we would improve the product based on how people were using it. And I remember at one point I had a room full of Microsoft people, and they all ran up to the small TV in the room and were reading some of the sessions, and I couldn't see it because I was not part of the rush. But they were all laughing hysterically, and so it was really fun. People enjoyed it. There was one interesting time, though, which was 9/11. And we were up and running through 9/11, and the kids, a lot of the instant messaging people were like 13-year-old kids, and they were all interacting during 9/11, and there was a lot of people upset. The team in New York who was doing SmarterChild's content was in real time having to update the bot to make sure that the responses were appropriate and try to be consoling and to recommend where you might reach out for some kind of help. This was all interesting. Also, the servers that were serving stock quotes were servers from Reuters that were hosted in the towers. So the stock quotes went down, and we had to switch to servers coming out of Europe. So the question was about
Was about how
people interact.
yeah, well, how did the actual use of SmarterChild differ from what you had initially planned?
Right. So it was fundamentally, the difference was that fundamentally we were thinking of this thing as a way to interact with computers, which is still legit, and SmarterChild and others were still used in that way substantially, but just the entertainment value is what became the huge killer app.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you just mentioned people looking up information on it, stock quotes, etc. One of the things that ChatGPT is maybe a little notorious about is that it can sometimes make up answers. How did could you maybe compare and contrast, like how did SmarterChild get its information? How did you know that it was giving users good information compared to ChatGPT?
We know that SmarterChild and the other bots were giving good information because there was just no opportunity otherwise. The entire creation of the bots was curated. As I say, we had a team mostly in New York that was handcrafting all of the responses. And a good example of how that works is we'd either have some subject matter expert doing sports, let's say, or we also would take the logs and process them, and any queries that were out there that were very popular that weren't getting answered would float to the top, and then we would answer them. And one interesting one, for example, is, there was a lot written about this, is when somebody asked SmarterChild, what is the airspeed velocity of an unladen swallow? And it would use the disambiguation. It would say, what do you mean? 1 period, what is the airspeed velocity of a European swallow? Or 2 period, what is the airspeed velocity of an African swallow? And there was an article at the time where the journalist said he set out to write one article and then was interacting with SmarterChild and ended up having to write a different article because he came upon exactly that query and realized that there's more going on here than just ELIZA kind of things. But 100% curated.
Right. So the answer is humans were making giving the answers.
I'll also say that I get frustrated with the pre-ChatGPT things like Alexa because they are run entirely by the machine learning and do a terrible, terrible job. For example, they forget, like for about 3 or 4 days one time, Alexa didn't know how to handle wake me in the morning. It just forgot. Or the Google voice search, you would say, take me home, expecting it to navigate you home. And Siri had no trouble with that. But there was a movie called Take Me Home, and it would tell you about that. And they had terrible trouble struggling with this because they were 100% machine learning, and a little bit of curation on the front would have solved that problem. Haven't thought much about what that means for the modern day with ChatGPT because, well, they do have the reinforced learning, which is that to maybe a better approach than simply the curation. But obviously that's an important aspect.
Right. Okay, we're going to transition now to a different sort of set of questions.
Actually, can I do one follow-up?
Okay, you want to do one? Okay.
Could you contrast curated and machine learning?
Yeah, that's a good
Okay.
question.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
The difference between curated and machine learning is huge. Well, if you look back when we were doing SmarterChild, there were some things that nobody knew how to do. Obviously, being able to digest natural language in terms of full text documents or the internet generally. We spent a lot of time trying to figure out how we could automatically use our technology to automatically extract content out of Wikipedia. And we had moderate success, which obviously ChatGPT has no trouble doing today. So we have basically several phases. You had what happened before ActiveBuddy, which is the company that did SmarterChild. And then you had what we did. And then you had the interim, which was machine learning, things like Alexa and Siri. And then you have ChatGPT. I think at ActiveBuddy, we used curation very successfully to solve this class of problems. Oh, and I was saying there are 2 things you didn't know how to do, which is digest general text And the other thing is speech to text. Speech to text was like the holy grail for us, so you could actually talk to it and it would transcribe it, and then it would feed it back into the bot we already had, which, by the way, is interesting as well, because we had assumed, and everybody had assumed, that a closed loop solution where the speech to text and the natural language processing were together, because it seems like you should be able to understand what somebody's saying a lot better if you know what they're talking about. And I'm still shocked today that the speech to text works now without any of that context information, without any tie into the natural language. So we spent a lot of time back then trying to understand natural language at large, and also to do speech text. And there were no good tools out there, and we weren't the ones to figure it out. So we went with a 100% curated solution where we generated all of the inputs and all of the outputs. And so it was very precise and very controlled. We knew we weren't going to be making things up. We knew we weren't going to be saying bad things to the user. But there were limits. And that's why I emphasize that something that still hasn't been explored today is using natural language as a computer interface is very promising. When you get to the deep learning and all that, only finally now, 20-some years later, have we gotten to a place where we're seeing better results than the curated. And by the way, it's much better results. It's like with the speech to text, there'd been a lot of effort, and the results were essentially a non-starter until suddenly they were much better. So this is exciting. And I'm really excited to see where the latest generation goes. And I'm not sure, it's as I said earlier, it's an interesting question whether the reinforcement learning is a better approach than doing curation. Or you could think of reinforcement with the humans in the loop is a curation of sorts. But we still have the big question with the modern technology of how do you know how it got that answer, and is it the truth? So there's a long way to go.
So what most excites you about chatbots and this technology moving into the future?
Yeah, interesting. What excites me about chatbots into the future? I was having a conversation with a friend of mine who's a computer science professor at MIT. We do a walk and talk whenever he's in town. And I'm frustrated with the current state of technology. All the apps, all of the websites, they're declining in quality. And I think it's because they've lost their visionaries who, they're wealthy and they've moved on. Everybody's hiring product managers who see their job as making changes, not good changes, but just making changes. I think today everybody would be happy if people just stopped changing the apps. So I was lamenting that the quality of Google search is going down fast, and are we going to see something come that would leapfrog Google in terms of the capability as a search engine? And his answer was great. He said, no, not until it's something completely different. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And then, a month later, ChatGPT launches. And it's like, now I understand what he means by something completely different. So I'm thinking that we're not going to see any improvements in Bing and Google, not substantial. But we're going to stop using them. And we're going to start using ChatGPT, or we're going to start using Neuralink, or something completely different. And that's going to be exciting. But what is that?
What do you see as chatbots' greatest potential to benefit humanity?
What's the benefit of chatbots to benefit humanity? And I'm a big believer in that we're going to get to full AGI. I also think that it could be dangerous. It's going to be an exciting ride. This idea that you can maybe regulate and slow it down doesn't make any sense, because like with nuclear weapons, you can regulate the countries that are participating in the regulation, but then there could be other countries who disregard that. And if you let them get ahead with the natural language, with the AGI, then they're going to just leapfrog, and you won't be able to catch up. So it's going to be an exciting ride. I think, for example, we're going to have self-driving cars that really work. As Bill Gates said, people always overestimate what's going to happen in 5 years and underestimate what's going to happen in 10 years. We're going to be looking back on chatbots, on self-driving cars, on humanoid robots in 10 years, and it's going to be just completely second nature, and everybody's going to be wondering what the fuss was.
So what do you see as their greatest potential harm?
Oh, it's an existential threat. You try to play out these scenarios like the chatbots today don't actually control anything, but that's not really true because like Twitter doesn't actually control anything, but it's forming public opinion. And if you had somebody really smart, say some artificial creation that's really smart and goes out there on Twitter, it could rally a huge force behind it. But where does that go? Yeah.
So you mentioned existential threat. Why are some people talking about existential threat, and why are others talking about a kind of utopia in our future?
Well, it's like with nuclear power and nuclear weapons, the technology can take you both directions. With robots, for example, we could do away with all the menial tasks, and it doesn't even seem to be a big leap. I was talking to a startup who was building internal walls in a shell space, office space, which seems like a very narrow niche for a startup. But what finally struck me after they're talking about trying to make the case for how their new technology is good, I said, oh, you know, what you really need is humanoid robots to solve this problem. And it just seems like such a no-brainer. It's such a simple problem relatively. So it's going to start with that kind of thing. And like if you look in factories today, they're not humanoid, but you have robots that are solving a lot of the problems. And people aren't getting laid off mostly, but they're getting reassigned, and the companies aren't having to continue to grow the headcount. And that trend is just going to happen. So you're going to end up with most of the labor done by robots.
Are we worried about the right things, and are we hopeful about the right things?
I think the biggest thing to worry about is climate change, and I don't think that's going to be solvable politically. But the economy may shift in that direction. The whole electric car thing, for example. Electric cars are, if not today, are within a year or two going to be much more compelling economically than internal combustion engines. So it's going to take care of itself. The question is whether it'll take care of itself fast enough. As far as computers are concerned, that's going to be exciting and hard to predict where it goes. If you get to the next version of the bots that actually get smart. So the big question everybody has is whether we took the whole internet, turned it into a bot, and ChatGPT, which is that's all you get, or if you can go beyond that. What is it that people do that create, that think, that you hypothesize, and then so you're making up a bunch of scenarios and picking the one that seems to be a good one. Will these bots be able to do that? And so it's the same question everybody's asking about, where does ChatGPT and the other AGIs go?
So some experts think that today's chatbots have strong limitations and that we need to explore alternative approaches to AI. Why?
I don't think alternative is the right way to think about what you do with the bots. I think we keep coming up with new approaches, and it just expands out their capabilities. For example, it wasn't very long ago that the whole idea of transformers showed up, and now that's being used, and that transformed everything. Going a different direction isn't the thing. Taking what we're doing and applying new capabilities, new ideas, will take you the next step each time. For example, people still don't know if you let ChatGPT generate a whole bunch of responses, if you take those responses as more input, does that change the nature of ChatGPT, or are those just all dependent results? And nobody knows the answer to any of these things. Nobody knows how you got the answers in the first place. So it's going to be exciting.
If you could create your own chatbot today, what would it be like, and what would it do?
I'm no longer in the chatbot business. I have a career of doing a whole bunch of different interesting things, and I haven't repeated. So I haven't given it a lot of thought. I've been watching with excitement, but I haven't been playing in that space.
Okay. So this is related to something you mentioned earlier. So a lot of commentators see the future of chatbots and AI as part of a power struggle between the United States and China. What do you think about this?
I do think that chatbots, or the whole artificial intelligence thing, could be a winner takes all. They grow exponentially. So once somebody gets ahead, it's going to be hard to catch up. And that could be the US, China, or it could be somebody in their garage. Because this whole idea that it takes $100 million worth of training to make the next chatbot is only currently the case. If things get more clever, or hardware gets better, then maybe we'll figure out a new way of climbing that curve without having to spend so much money, and then that puts it in the hands of a completely different set of people.
So there seem to be many issues about trust surrounding chatbots, from the explainability of their operation, as you mentioned, to producing falsehoods and dangerous suggestions, to bias, to the organizations that make and use them. How important are these issues of trust to the future of chatbots?
It's all one big continuum, that people having trouble trusting the chatbots, the same as people having trouble trusting Wikipedia. When my kids were in school, they were told that you can't use Wikipedia as a source because it's unreliable, where in fact, Wikipedia is remarkably reliable because of the mechanism of the different curators. And I imagine those same sorts of trends will apply to the chatbots. The people making the chatbots obviously have a vested interest in solving that problem. And don't forget, you can have chatbots talking to chatbots as well to solve that problem. Just like the self-driving cars, you use simulators now. You can generate scenarios without having any real-world training data. And that's computers feeding back into computers to make things better. Where does it end?
Creating chatbots and other AI systems use a huge amount of energy and natural resources like water and materials. Is AI environmentally sustainable?
Well, it begs the question, is intelligence environmentally sustainable? People themselves are having a problem dealing with the limited capacity of the Earth. I do think that the technologies will evolve to reduce the footprint of the training, and maybe we'll get to where they can be trained incrementally so that you don't need to spend nearly as much. I mean, that's got to happen. But you can't worry about an occasional technology using a lot of resources, because it's just one, right? You've got billions of cars and one ChatGPT being trained. Or one rocket being launched in Texas that has a big carbon footprint, but as far as its percentage of the problem, it doesn't add up. If you're going to clean up your hard drive, you start with the big files, not the thousands and thousands of little files.
So some experts say that today's chatbots only give the appearance of understanding, while other experts say that they are emergent learners, that they do understand things about the world. What is your take?
Well, that's the big question, whether what you're getting out of ChatGPT, for example, is something that's understanding. I'm not sure that when I talk to a person, what I get from them is anything more than what's happening to some degree in these today's chatbots. Is there a threshold, or is it just a continuum? And quite often these days, when I'm talking to somebody, I think about how those thoughts are forming, and I don't have, it's not like I'm engaged actively in thinking. I'm just speaking, and it feels to me similar to what's happening with these chatbots. Now, when I try to solve a problem and I go and I ponder or whatever, that's different perhaps. But most of the time when I'm just talking, it's not much different.
Are there privacy issues with chatbots, and if so, why?
I just finished 2 years at a cybersecurity company, and I'm quite convinced that there are security and privacy issues everywhere, not just with chatbots. That the technology that we've built on the internet is inherently insecure, and people have no privacy and security. And if you get chatbots that are a little bit smarter and are told to and have the capability of going out and doing their own reconnaissance, then they'll be able to break into places and collect data. That's one of the big concerns, I think, is not that they're going to be shutting down the power plants, but that they're going to become much better tools for existing hackers.
What are the copyright and other intellectual property concerns about chatbots and generative AI?
Well, when you talk about copyrights and related concerns, you get into the bigger question of whether copyright laws themselves are appropriate. I think of Richard Stallman a lot when we talk about copyrights, and the fact that Steamboat Willie is still under copyright. There's no reason to allow that sort of thing. So I think people get far too much ability to copyright materials now, and the idea of doing mashups is very valuable. And so where do you set that scale? And I think we're protecting things way too hard now. When it comes to the specific idea that ChatGPT read the internet and is now regurgitating things, including copyrighted materials, well, people are informed the same way. People read materials and then they write their own materials, and they're informed from that same copyrighted material. So it's going to be a really good question, but I think people should just not worry about it so much. The benefit of it happening is much better than the protection, the extravagant protection that the copyright holders are getting.
How important are critical voices to the development of chatbots and AI?
I don't think critical voices are going to matter in the development of chatbots. For example, the guy that was slated to run OpenAI due to these latest changes said he wants to slow things down from 100, not to 0.1, but maybe to 2 or 3. And I'm thinking, that's absurd. The purpose of that business is to advance the state of the art. And to deliberately go slow doesn't make any sense.
What is the most important thing for everyone to understand about chatbots?
The most important thing about chatbots to understand, they're tools. You know, schools are worried about it. I'm thinking schools teach a lot of things that computers can do well, and like arithmetic. You know, there was a long time when calculators weren't allowed in the classroom, and now they are. If you can use ChatGPT to turn in a term paper that convinces the teacher that it deserves a good grade, then so be it. That means that there's a flaw in the evaluation process. On the other hand, starting with output from a chatbot and then massaging it and using that as source material to do a better job of writing, I think is totally legitimate.
What's the greatest misunderstanding about chatbots?
Now, this is an interesting one. when you talk about computers generally, it's all esoteric, it's coding and whatever. Now we're in the realm of natural language. And every human on the planet is an absolute expert in natural language understanding. That's built in. You can take anybody and they understand the nuances of natural language. So to think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what's going on, the way that you misunderstand how your self-driving car works, I don't think that's reasonable. People can very easily understand the whole nature of what's going on.
What can we learn about what can we learn from the history of chatbots and of AI?
I don't think you can learn much from the history of chatbots. As I said, we went from last century where there wasn't much progress in chatbots, just a few toy examples, to what we did with SmarterChild, which garnered a wide audience, was a useful tool, good entertainment, but still limited. And then no significant progress, more utility, but no progress from a natural language perspective until now we're at a new threshold. And it's a quantum leap, and I don't think that what happened before is informing what's going forward. It's just like with speech to text. You didn't have it, and now you have it. And going and studying all of the approaches of speech to text from before doesn't really give you much.
Mm-hmm. Are chatbots conscious?
I think it's a continuum, that chatbots probably aren't conscious today, but are we missing something huge and fundamental, or is it a question of degree before we get to conscious? And what is conscious? And I think about that, to me, there's a difference between conscious and creative or problem solving. To me, the problem solving is the interesting one. And when I'm problem solving, I think what I'm doing is I'm generating a bunch of different possible hypotheses and then being able to somehow evaluate them. And can the chatbots today do that? I don't think so. But is that an impossible step or just a question of degree? And I think it's a question of degree.
So what do today's chatbots do best?
Today's chatbots are remarkable. That it's one of these huge leaps. We went from not having it to having it, the same as the speech to text or whatever. You can get information from it. It's able to read the text on the internet and make sense of it, make it useful at least to the reader, which is a completely new capability. It's not the chatbots so far aren't good at doing reasoning themselves in sense of or solving math problems or. But again, a question of degree.
Mm-hmm. So what are their greatest weaknesses?
Chatbots' greatest weaknesses. People have weaknesses too. And I think what I'm seeing is it's just a question of degree. Right now, the chatbots are suffering from the hallucinations, for example, to a large degree. But I know people who do that too. And somehow they get to be introspective and manage to tamp that down. What's going to happen with the chatbots to make that better is that reinforcement learning? Is that better technology? So obviously it's a weakness now, but people are working to fix it.
Just to repeat what you're saying about how today's chatbots don't know what they don't know versus what...
Right. One thing when you're building a chatbot that's really important is to know when you don't know. And none of the chatbots these days does that. You ask Alexa a question, and instead of it just saying, I don't know, which a lot of people I think would appreciate, it says, here's something I found on the web, or gives you something that's a completely wrong answer. It's hard to know when you don't know. SmarterChild, we spent a lot of time and we were good at that. And one of the advantages is that if somebody asks a question that SmarterChild or the other bots doesn't know, then those get filtered back to the developers, and that gives them good fodder for knowing how to enhance the bot. But these days, if you have an answer for everything, and this goes with ChatGPT as well, if you have an answer for everything, then how do you know which questions need to be better informed by the creators, the curators?
Right. And actually, let's go back to like the thing we were talking about before, comparing the difference between SmarterChild and the Siri, Alexa, the machine learning based chatbots. We were talking about how they didn't get any better, even though they basically replaced human curation with machine learning, and how you're mentioning how they're biasing
Right.
the result, the training.
So we have the two different approaches, the curated version that we did back with SmarterChild, and then the machine learning, which comes from labeled data today. And whenever we wanted a different answer or a better answer, people got in the loop and just did it. Today, my understanding is that companies like Amazon, if they want Alexa to give a certain kind of answer, instead of just curating that answer, and there are probably like 100 questions that are the most common questions that cover 90% of what Alexa answers, they could just curate that and be done. Instead, they bias the training data by adding more labeled data and try to push the answers where you want. And that's not legitimate either. So we did SmarterChild and the other bots in the early 2000s, and we're 20 years later, and Siri and Alexa and Google's bots, they are really no better. They have a completely different underlying technology, which involves the machine learning, but they don't do any better job of answering the questions. In fact, I spoke with some people at Siri whose job, they said, was to make Siri better. And so I said to them, I said, look, this is natural language. Every human on the planet is an expert in natural language. You should be able to communicate to anybody what it is you are trying to do when you say make Siri better. For example, here's a question we ask Siri. Here's what Siri does today. Here's what we want Siri to say. And none of that team was willing to come up with a single example that would indicate to anybody what it is that they want to accomplish by making Siri better. So I volunteered one, and I said, Siri, turn off all the lights but the front porch. Now, you know what I mean by that. Anybody would understand the nuance there instantly. And his answer was, oh, that's hard. So I'm not impressed with the bots that followed for 20 years. Finally, as I said, we have these new chatbots that are like ChatGPT that are making a huge leapfrog, and they have essentially no relationship with what's gone on before. You can't think of what's inside Alexa and ChatGPT as being a continuum. It's just not there.
All right.